So, we have learnt that race is a construct invented to differentiate and separate people based on our natural human differences. As Dr. Dorothy Roberts said, race is a political category that has been disguised as a biological one. We've also learnt why race was invented, to justify the dehumanisation and enslavement of African people that European economies had become dependent on in terms of wealth, power, hierarchy and status. But where does whiteness come in? Well, the concept of whiteness didn't really begin to emerge until the late 1600s, and it started in the English Caribbean. In the early days of enslavement, black people were not the only people working the plantations. Often, white Irish indentured servants worked alongside. Indentured servitude was a system where people were forced to work without pay in order to repay a debt. It was a form of slavery, but it was not chattel slavery, because once that debt was repaid, people were freed, and enslavers could not buy, sell, or trade Irish people in the way that they could African people. And crucially, their enforced labour was not passed on to their children either. All enslaved people would work side by side, and one of the biggest fears of enslavers was that black enslaved Africans and white indentured servants would come together in their common interest to fight against them. So as early as 1661, they began to introduce laws or slave codes to prevent this. Despite this, their worst fears did come true when all enslaved people recognised their enslavers as a shared enemy and came together and attacked them in a revolt called Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. This rebellion toppled the capital of Virginia. Enslavers realised that the unity between enslaved Africans and white indentured servants could very well be their undoing, and they needed to take further action to divide these groups from each other. So additional laws were created which gave indentured servants privileges by the fact that they were white that were not given to black people. Enslaved Africans, and them alone, were recategorized as chattel slaves, meaning they were viewed as property, not human, and this allowed them to be denied even basic human rights guaranteed under common law, even the right to life. This meant that their enslavers could do entirely as they wished without fear of reprisal, and they did. An enslaved person did not even have the right to defend themselves, and enslavers would punish with impunity, including mutilation, rape, and burning people alive. The Christian moral code could conveniently be sidestepped, so long as enslaved Africans weren't considered human, and the racist pseudoscience that followed helped reinforce these ideals. Back on the plantations, having worked out their indenture, white people could become overseers themselves, buy or receive land, make their own money, and ultimately buy enslaved people. Meaning white, previously indentured servants could say, "You are inferior to me, because the law says so, and society tells us so too." This was the beginning of the idea that whiteness itself was, and remains, a benefit, a privilege, and is a status that white people should want to have, and it's their right to have. By enshrining a notion of white superiority to justify black subjugation, an idea of who is entitled to certain privileges in society gradually began to emerge. And sadly, the idea of whiteness did not finish when enslavement was made illegal. The previously enslaved Africans were not suddenly granted the same rights or even given the same wealth, land, and education as their white countrymen, let alone as their enslavers. And this imbalance in distribution of wealth and power is still borne out and continued to be enshrined in laws and embedded in society post-enslavement. Think about Jim Crow America and apartheid South Africa. And it wasn't until World War I that Britain relaxed its colour bar that stated black people could not be part of the British military. Whiteness kept and keeps people from the bottom, even if you are poor, broke, and dispossessed. This means whiteness has become a useful political tool. By pitting poorer people against each other, no matter how wide the gap between rich and poor, class tensions between white people were and are eased by whiteness. Its usefulness means whiteness has been used as a weapon against other groups over time, even against white people. Let's break that down. Whiteness was created to uphold power and create wealth. So, what counts as white depends on what politics and society who hold that power need. For example, we have just seen that whiteness once excluded, then included white Irish people. Later, it would be weaponized again. There is no doubt that the majority of Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities are white, yet they certainly face some of the most overt and blatant forms of racism, so much so that the hatred of them is often palpable and entirely normalised. And it's worth noting too that whiteness can mean different things even in different places. In the US, for example, note how Hispanic communities are excluded from whiteness, but in the UK, people with Spanish heritage don't face the same systemic issues. So, Gypsy Roma traveller people are generally white, and Irish people are generally white, yet both of these communities have a long history of being oppressed, as of course do Jewish people, who also tend to be racialised as white these days, but whose skin colour did not protect them from white supremacy in the Holocaust. It can be confusing, can't it? So, if white people can be oppressed too, then what does that mean for the definition of whiteness? When is white white enough? In much the same way that racism as a construct needs to be recognised and understood, so does whiteness as an ideology. And anti-racism essentially means to fight that ideology of whiteness, not white people. Though of course, those who are racialised as white need to step up and play their part in anti-racism, because racism is benefiting them, whether they like it or not. At its most extreme, white supremacy demands so-called racial purity, involving the eradication of Jewish people, the enslavement of black people, the subjugation of all other people of the global majority, the conversion or eradication of all non-Christian religions, and the elimination of so-called impurities, which include the LGBTQ+ community, disabled people, neurodivergent people, Gypsy Roma travellers, and any form of interracial relationships. White supremacist extremes do exist, and yes, we should pay attention to neo-Nazis and the KKK. But being anti-racist means to recognise that when we talk about white supremacy, we aren't just talking about these extremes. We're talking about the foundation that allows these extremes to exist, the way it has pervaded throughout society, how white is regarded as the norm, the standard for human beings, and it impacts your life whether you want it to or not. Whiteness as the norm is a difficult ideology to escape because it's often not conscious, not thought about. It just is. Plasters in first aid boxes, pictures in medical books, as well as medical trials and studies, school hair policies, perceived professionalism at work, assumed working patterns and holidays, stereotypes, arrest rates, the list is endless. It's been in place for a long time, and it takes deliberate work to unpick it and to actively work against it. In fact, whiteness as an ideology is so pervasive that it has been absorbed by everyone, no matter their skin colour. A black, brown, Irish, Jewish or Gypsy Roma traveller person can, and very often do, all uphold the ideology, even though they are negatively impacted by it. And that's why anti-racism is so important to everyone. For white people, checking and using our privilege as well as learning our actual history and why we have these categories in the first place are phenomenal tactics to start disrupting white supremacy. This isn't about being ashamed of history or trying to rewrite it. It's about knowing the truth and learning how it affects our present. It can feel overwhelming knowing where to begin, and this framework may help you recognise some of the characteristics of a white supremacist culture. How could you do things to work against this pervasive ideology? Remember, being anti-racist starts with you.